I'm Madeline Blair, and this is Unlocked. On today's show, we'll be talking about the new rules for business leadership communication. My guest, Matt Kohut, will answer the question why values aren't enough. After our conversation, I'll be sharing a communication lesson I learned even after I thought I had learned it all. So stay tuned. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Madeline Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about activating the resilient leader in you. I was raised that all humans are worthy to be respected. My mother treated everyone exactly the same. As a result, when I created Unlocked, I wanted it to always be about giving you, my viewers, something of value, regardless of your political persuasion, your social standing, where you live, your age, whatever. Today, we may need to talk about political or social issues to illustrate why business leadership communication needs new rules. When we do use political or social issues, please keep in mind they are used to explore the reasons behind the call for a different communication approach. So thanks for understanding. There is a new book out. It's called Speaking Out: The New Rules of Leadership Communication. Today, the author, Matthew Kohut, will be talking about what he is trying to convey in a book that I have found to be exciting in its illustrations and in its conclusions. And I suspect you're going to get an inkling of what's in there from our conversation. Matthew Kohut is the author. He is a co-author, by the way, of The Smart Mission, NASA's Lessons for Managing Knowledge, People, and Projects. He's also a co-author of Compelling People, The Hidden Qualities That Make Us Influential, and one of Amazon's best business books in 2013. As a managing partner of KNP Communications, Matt has prepared CEOs, elected officials, public figures for events from live television appearances to TED Talks. Matt has taught at George Washington University and held a fellowship at Bennington College. His writing has appeared in publications from Harvard Business Review to Newsweek. With that, let me bring on Matthew Kohut. Welcome to Unlocked, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me, Madeline. It's great to be here.
Good. In fact, I should say welcome back to Unlocked. This is your second appearance, which I'm very happy about because I love this new book and that we have a chance to talk about it. Well, I want to just leap right in. What is it about today's environment that CEOs can no longer ignore political and social issues? I always viewed companies as existing within a community, and that the role of profit was supposed to be balanced against service to the community. Is this too simple a way of looking at this issue of communication?
I don't think it is, because in some broader sense, I think you've been right that that's always been the case. And certainly that was the case historically, where businesses existed in communities and had responsibilities to those communities, as well as contributing to those communities by offering jobs and other things. And just to make one thing clear, this idea of CEOs and other business leaders addressing political and social issues is nothing new. What's new is that they actually are the voice at the microphone more frequently over the past dozen or so years than before that. But for decades, there are instances of business leaders being involved in one way or another with political and social issues. It was just often behind the scenes, and it was hidden from public view largely. And The 20th century model was to essentially try and do everything you could to avoid the limelight. And social media has essentially made that impossible over the past 15 years or so.
Gosh, I never thought of it being social media that would force them out, so to speak.
I think it's a big part of it.
Yeah, yeah. And when you're in that arena, suddenly the audience is also speaking.
Yeah, exactly. The town square is a noisy place.
You know, in those situations, you have to be listening as well. And, I've always believed in listening, and not just because I'm the host of Unlocked. My guests have almost always mentioned the value of listening. So when I read in your book, listening to learn from employees requires different skills than the ones used when listening to make decisions about business problems, I had to stop and say to myself, how can this be? I mean, what's the difference between listening to employees or listening in relationship to a business decision?
Well, think about it this way. The the event that was really in some way the seminal moment that brings this into focus for a lot of people was the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020. And suddenly a lot of executives in large firms across the United States were having conversations with Black and brown employees about their lives that reflected real vast differences in lived experience. And one of the things that came out of the learnings that some of these executives had and shared with me as a result of some of these conversations, these are primarily white executives I'm talking about here, was that they weren't going into these conversations to, quote, solve problems. They were simply going into these conversations to try and understand what their employees' experience was and to just absorb it and really be there simply to hear. And that's fundamentally different than when you assemble a bunch of people around a table and say, what's going on in our marketing effort here? And you're asking for inputs from the various people. And then you're saying, okay, so it sounds like this is the problem. Let's do X. Very different fundamental dynamic there. And the idea that you have to say something or that you have to give some sense that you have some understanding of things is oftentimes the exact opposite in these much more personal conversations. And that was one kind of these conversations, but they happen all the time. I mean, you can think about this on a much smaller scale when you run a small business of some sort and somebody's been through a great personal loss. Let's say maybe they've lost a family member, and no matter what you yourself have been through as a leader in terms of personal losses, you never know what it's like to be that person. And it's that kind of sensitivity. And if somebody says, I lost my mother, I'm absolutely devastated, saying, I know what you mean, I lost my mother too, is going to be exactly the wrong thing in many cases because you don't know. And it's that kind of listening, just being an ear and being there for people simply because they need someone to be there for them. That is, I think, an increasingly important thing that leaders are waking up to the need to do. And like I said, it's very different than listening to problem solve.
Well, what this reminds me of is the generation that really feels that they're not being heard. And that what you're saying is your employees need to hear that they have been heard.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
I like that. Now I can really see the difference between those two kinds of communication. As in a business decision, you really are, okay, the mission is this is the issue, what's our next step? Whereas when you're talking to an employee, there may not be a next step other than to just continue listening.
Exactly.
I've worked with storytelling for many years. So, I was delighted to read your second new rule about the value of our lived experiences. And your book is full of stories. Executives have often felt that their lives were private. I think you were beginning to hint on that in your previous answer, almost as if revealing too much would make them too human. But you say that personal stories are important in communication to all of the executive's office audiences, employees, customers, stakeholders. Why do you push these executives to think about their own experience as part of their communication? And can you give us a little story about an executive who did make that shift?
Sure. I think that executives telling their personal stories isn't a cure all. It's one thing, it's a tool in the toolbox, but I think it can be a really valuable tool in the toolbox that, as you said, was previously thought to be off limits. And there is a sliding scale of how much a person might want to reveal about themselves. So I'll give you an example of an executive who I think is very modest publicly. That's Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. And the example of him using his personal story here was really in service of Microsoft's mission, I would say, as far as supporting his people. And if you cast your mind back almost exactly 8 years, I'm going to the spring of 2017 here, there was a new administration that announced what it called a Muslim ban. And many companies felt compelled to speak out about this because they felt like people who were in their workforce were being excluded. It certainly was going to have an impact on their ability to attract immigrants to their workforce in the United States if people couldn't get here. And Satya Nadella spoke about his experience as an immigrant when talking about his opposition to this policy and how he thought it wasn't good for the country. It wasn't consistent with the country's values. And he essentially used his own experience as an example of the American dream. So that's one example that comes to mind where the story is really being used in service of the business.
When I read that, I was thinking about the fact that even in my own situation, there are things that I was very reluctant to share with other people professionally. I felt that was inappropriate for a professional. And over the years, thanks to people who were encouraging me, yourself included, I realized that people really want to know about who you are. And so I have shared stories about all kinds of things. And it felt really strange at first. It was sort of almost like it was against the rules. And now your book just validates that I was moving in the right direction, even though I did it a little bit reluctantly, sort of with my heels in the sand. But it is different. And you're right. I think that executives often have felt not only were they in the background that they shouldn't reveal it because they would be looking too human.
I think there's some of that. And I think that some people feel like, gosh, it's immodest of me to use personal story. I want to give some people the benefit of the doubt of feeling like, gosh, I shouldn't be talking about myself.
Yeah.
It's not right. But I think the flip side of that is people can show some personal vulnerability too. And that can actually warm people up to you. And so I think if you're a self-aggrandizer who's always talking about yourself, then yes, this can backfire quite easily. But for so many CEOs, particularly older CEOs who are from the 20th century, and I firmly put myself as a creature of the 20th century here, let's be clear, the idea that you can reveal a little bit about yourself and humanize, essentially, I think is something that's been a feature of the landscape in the past, again, 15 years, and something that I encourage leaders to look for opportunities to do, both externally, like we're talking about, and more importantly, internally, when they're communicating internally with their own team in town hall meetings and things like that. It really makes them much more relatable, or can make them much more relatable.
As you're talking, I thought of something that happened just recently. My sister has a music school. She's a pianist, and she's been doing this school for a long time. She has many students. Everybody loves her. And the example that was offered, we had a session where we were talking about what she had done in her life. And one of her students had become a teacher in her school, and gave the example of how my sister would teach one of the students because he described a situation where he had real difficulty in helping the child learn to work the right hand and the left hand to do different things at the same time. And he said, Elaine, my sister, came in the room and she said, when I do something, and then she described what she did. And he said, instantly, the student figured it out and was playing. So it was a perfect example of just bringing it to personal and just sharing it. And it changed things completely.
I like that.
Yeah. I wish I could tell the story better, but it wasn't my story. I'm just, yeah.
Well, you've actually just made the point. You've just validated how powerful story is. It's so powerful that you remember it and then you share it again.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of why story is can often be more effective than simply making an airtight logic case with bullet points.
That's right. Yeah. I remember years ago when we were first working in storytelling. For those who don't know, I was involved in it for the last, 24 years. And one of the prime examples was Disney. The Disney Corporation, when Disney was alive, well, even after he died, there were stories about Disney because they told about the culture of the organization. And how else could you have discovered that Disney was all about creativity? And then you hear these stories of Disney and how he would work like crazy to make things imaginative. Yeah. Yes. All right. There's another rule that knocked me on my heels. And that was this one about values. Now, values are incredibly important to me. I mean, I was raised with really clear values of what was important in life, what was important for you to always do and be, etc. But you said that it's not enough. So say what that means.
So I do firmly agree with you that values are incredibly important. I think they're almost like the North Star that you navigate by. But at the end of the day, leaders, when thinking about what they're going to say about this issue or that issue, can consult their values, but ultimately they also have to back their words with action.
Yeah.
And that's really what I think, if there's anything that I've suggested in this book that probably doesn't come up as often as it might in other playbooks along these lines, is that when you decide, I'm going to say something about this issue that's particularly salient for our customers or our employees or whomever right now, here's what I say about it and here's what we're going to do about it. And the what we're going to do about it part should be non-negotiable. There should have to be an action that corresponds to the words.
Yeah. It reminds me of my mother telling me, Madeline, you don't have to worry about what you tell your children. It's what you do, because that's what they're going to copy. Oh gosh, isn't it amazing how these huge stories about executive come down to something very simple in our lives?
They do, yeah.
I love this. I really love this because it puts the executive on notice that if you're going to bring your values into the equation, which they should and do, then you have to make sure that you're acting consistently.
Right.
I often ask people in the work that I do with them to say, every morning you should decide what's the most important thing for you to do. And and of course they struggle with that. And it's actually a very hard thing to do. I mean, I've done it for years, and sometimes it's really hard because there'll be two things that are competing with one another, and I somehow have to figure out which is the most important. And it almost always involves values. What's the most important to me? And then it affects it that way.
Let me offer a quick example just from yesterday. So yesterday was Veterans Day here in the United States. And I guarantee you that there were a handful of corporations out there that said, thank you, veterans, for your service to our country. More than a handful. I'm sure there were many companies that had some sort of a way of recognizing veterans yesterday. If I were advising a corporation, and certainly a CEO who was acting as the mouthpiece to say something like that, I would say absolutely recognize veterans, recognize the value of patriotism, and then explain what you're doing to hire veterans so that you're not just saying, hey, great, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Come work for us. We have a plan to hire you and bring on board all this terrific capability that you have. And we want to both respect your service, reward it, honor it, and show you how valuable you can continue to be to our culture.
I like that. I like that a lot. And it's such an easy shift uh, to make that compliment real, that you're going to do something about it.
I think it's just an easy one to pluck from the headlines from yesterday. Yeah.
For sure, for sure. Uh, are there is there a favorite story from your? We kind of. I'm going to digress. Is there a favorite story from your book? Because I know there are just some wonderful ones that I read um, in it.
You know, there is a favorite actually. Now that you mention it, it took me a hair of a second to think of it, but it was really around. It goes back to our conversation about listening, and my favorite story was about what LinkedIn has done. So let me back up a little bit. One of the things I talked about was about listening to employees. And this is where you and I started off on this idea of listening to employees just to understand their lives. And LinkedIn has a very robust employee resource group initiative. They have lots of ERGs, as they're called, and they're well funded and they're really a core feature for employees who are at LinkedIn. And one thing that really caught my attention and I thought was really a unique way of working with ERGs was that when a political or social issue comes up that's relevant to the members of an ERG, the executives and the communications team that are thinking about this talk to the ERG and consult them down to the level where the ERG might even be reviewing a statement that might be made externally, because LinkedIn's leaders really want to make sure that what LinkedIn is saying on the outside is consistent with what its team members are feeling on the inside of the company. So if they say we support X, but on the inside people are not feeling supported, then that's exactly what they're trying to avoid. And I think this is a really remarkable use of employee resource groups to really inform the communications function and the CEO as the speaker when that's the case. So to me, that was absolutely a favorite thing to learn about. And I thought it was a practice that could easily be adapted and or adopted by so many other organizations when thinking about different issues. That doesn't mean that the ERGs rule the roost, but it means they have an active voice in anything that's communicated that's got direct relevance to them.
You're right. It's the voice that you have given them,
Right.
and there is no promise that you will follow it, but
Mm-hmm.
that's okay. You've clearly been heard in that process, and
That's exactly right. Yeah.
people love to be heard. We really do. That's part that's part of
Yeah.
what our human nature is. Ah, I yeah, I can see why that's a favorite story. An employee resource group. I've spent a lot of time talking about communities of practice where you allow groups of people, employees, to talk about issues so that you can share knowledge, etc. But this is a different kind of group, really, really powerful, because it does another thing. It also conveys the message to the employees that you're giving outside. You don't always sit around reading the annual report of a company, and you certainly aren't in the room when the executive necessarily addresses the board. And this is a way that, or the press or anything, this is a way to get that in there. Nice. I can see why it's your favorite. Wow. I know that you've always been involved in presenting, helping people present themselves well. I assume that was the genesis of this book.
Yeah, it was in some ways. I mean, I've been working with CEOs and executive directors of nonprofit organizations as well for over, for 12, 15 years, something like that. And so I've been parts of lots of different conversations about messaging at all kinds of levels in smaller organizations as well as larger ones. And I wanted to be able to help provide some tools for executives who are thinking, how do I handle this in my next all hands meeting? Or what should we say something about this issue? There's an if question there. What should we say? How should we say it? Who should be the messenger here? And to a certain extent, it was also just because I had really been tracking this issue for several years and watching this emerge from, say, 2011 to the present. It wasn't always the case, as you said, that CEOs were talking about these things. And I started keeping a little folder where I was thinking, oh, this is different. I'm surprised to hear a CEO say X or Y. And over time, it occurred to me there was a critical mass that had been achieved.
Okay, I think it would be good to just tell our audience what those new rules are. I mean, just very briefly, I'll list them, and then you pick up, because some of them we've already talked about. Maybe there's something where you want to expand. The first was to listen first, and we certainly have explored that, which I loved. Lived experience matters. Is that about storytelling?
That's the storytelling chapter. That's basically using story when appropriate to make a point.
I just wrote a blog on the value of experience to making decisions. and the fact that when you have to make a choice, you invariably go back to your own experiences yourself and what you've seen around you. Yeah. All right. Then values matter. Okay, we've talked about that. Values are not enough. Oh my goodness, we've done a really good job. Have a process. We haven't talked about that.
Right. So the last chapter of the book is called Have a Process. It could have been called Have a Plan, but I wanted it to sound even more like something you've really figured out. And the idea here is that you shouldn't be shooting from the hip when talking about political and social issues. And sometimes people get lucky and they tweet something out at a moment of passion and it works out. But many more times than that, something blows up. And these are preventable errors. And so what I suggest in the book is essentially a way of walking through the practicalities of thinking, is this an issue that's relevant to us? Thinking about mission, values, the work of the organization. Is it something, which stakeholders does it matter to? Is it our employees? Is it our customers? Is it someone else who's critical to our success? And then you start asking yourself, what are the risks? If I do this, if I say this, how could this blow up in my face? Mm-hmm. What would the cost to my personal reputation be? What would the cost to the corporate reputation be? And is there a moral dimension to this as well? And I think these are all questions you have to ask yourself. There are no right or wrong answers here. A lot of times the answer is going to be, gosh, we shouldn't say anything. Let's be really clear. We've been talking about speaking. A lot of times there are strategic uses of silence. Yes. And you go through this process and you decide if, when, and how you're going to say something. And part of that risk analysis is really trying to game it out. I know that you are familiar with the pre-mortem that Gary Klein has suggested for projects where you think, if we do things like this, how might this completely fail within a year? And what stories can we tell ourselves about that? I think it's exactly the same kind of exercise that's great to do around communication. If we put this message out here, what are all the ways this could go absolutely wrong? And let's write all the narratives we can about how this could completely be a disaster for us, and face them as clearly as we can, so we decide if we want to say this thing, say it differently, or not say it.
Yeah, the words that are going through my head are clickbait. So much of what is out there today is just to attract our eyes. That's right. And our attention. And it's a real challenge for me because I'm writing all the time, and I've got, what am I going to title this show? Each show has to be attractive, but I don't want it to be clickbait.
Right.
and sometimes I miss, and sometimes I hit.
Yep,
Hmm.
me too.
Well, I think we all do. But I love the idea though that you pause before you finish. Now I know sometimes when I'm writing something really important that's going to go out, I literally will write it one day and I'll review it the next day because that
Right,
gives me the time because I don't have somebody I can necessarily ask. So
right.
maybe I do. I have to think about a test audience. I have to think about an employee resource group that I'll call it friends resource group.
Right. Yeah, you need your own kitchen cabinet. I mean, when you think about CEOs of big Fortune 500 companies, they have these communications teams that are highly skilled. They've got agencies on call. They've got, flotillas and armies that can basically do corporate reputation risk assessment here and personal reputation risk assessment. And with all that said, at the end of the day, it still needs to be a call where somebody says, this is what we stand for. This is what matters deeply here. And we're either going to say this or we're not going to say it.
Mm-hmm. It goes back many, many years, but there was a, a famous story from Johnson and Johnson when there were there was a problem with Tylenol,
Mm,
and I happened to have a friend of mine was in fact in charge of their communications, and she's what she focused very much on was what is Johnson and Johnson's highest value, and that was safety. And so all the communications were about that. They stripped all the Tylenol off the shelves to just prove that what they said through their acts, as you suggested, was they were safe. Yeah, amazing.
I'm glad you mentioned the Tylenol case because, in fact, you might remember in the preface of the book, I mention it as an exemplar to me.
Ah,
And I think that
yes.
where this whole speaking out business is concerned, there are waves when CEOs speak out more. There are waves when they speak out less. I would say right now, CEOs are treading a little more lightly on political and social issues than they were in 2021, 2022. And that doesn't mean that they're never going to do it again. But the lessons here, I think I wanted them to be as evergreen as the lessons from the Tylenol
Yeah.
case study, which are still with us to this day. If you want to do corporate crisis communications well, you look at Johnson and Johnson's response to Tylenol, which is to get the information out there, stress the value of safety, tell people exactly what you're doing about it and how you're rectifying the situation. And to this day, it's really an exemplar.
Mm. Well, we've been talking about executives and companies, but my audience is filled with people between the ages of about 30, some in the 20s, but mostly 30s to the 60s. Okay. They're in various places in their career. Some of them are at pivot points. Some of them are CEOs. I know that. Some of them are aspiring. So, how can people take these wonderful lessons and bring them into their lives effectively so that they can really pursue what they want to pursue? Maybe start a new company or whatever.
Well, I think that executives or business owners at any level can be thinking about these questions. I was just doing a little talk in my hometown a few weeks ago, and one of the people in the audience owns one of the most esteemed record stores in the United States. And I say that as a little bit of a point of pride because it's local, but it's been written about in the New York Times and so on. It has a national reputation. And he thinks about these questions all the time about what kinds of support for his employees he wants to make public in the window of his store, for instance, what might or might not be appropriate to use on their Instagram feed, which is a very sort of hot source for them for reaching people.
Mm-hmm.
And these questions apply to business owners of basically all shapes and sizes. And look, I think there is a principled way to say, you know what, we just don't involve ourselves in things if you have a very small business and if your business is really uniform in some way. But if you have a diverse population of employees, customers, lots of people in different functional areas, people at different levels of education, at some point you're going to have to engage. And you can try to minimize that to the greatest extent possible, but sooner or later there might be something where you just don't have a choice about it. I'll give you just one quick example from the book. One of the business owners or one of the business leaders I talked to is the CEO of a company that has a bunch of different drug and alcohol recovery centers. And she said, I really want to stay completely out of this, because if you're an addict and you're struggling, you shouldn't feel like you can't come to our center because you have this kind of political view or that kind of political view. I
Mm.
completely understand and respect that. And if you think back to the beginning of 2021, when the COVID vaccine was rolling out, she had to make very clear on the company's website that if you wanted to work for this company, you had to be vaccinated.
Mm.
Now, at the very beginning of that, it wasn't a controversial or, quote, political issue. Suddenly it became one as the vaccine became politicized. And she had to stand firm on that. She did not want it to be a political thing, but because the issue got politicized, she had to basically hold her line in the sand on that, so to speak. It broke her heart to have to do it, because again, she doesn't want anyone to feel like they couldn't come to her facilities, or to equate that with a political position on her part, but it really mattered to the safety of her patients. And so it's an example of how this stuff creeps in places we don't ever really anticipate that it might.
I'm still thinking about it from the perspective of, let's say, a young person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Obviously, they're not speaking as a company. Well, I can't say that because I actually have had people on the show who were CEOs in their 20s and they'd already had 3 companies. It's like, wow.
When do you sleep?
I know. But there habits that one should bring um, into your behaviors that would guard you. Now, and I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about
Mm-hmm.
social media and the fact that social
Mm-hmm.
media is out there and it's always out there.
Mm-hmm.
And you may think it's rather clever today to say something, uh, and yet it could bite you. And
Yeah, so I think actually now I see where you're going with this, and I think that's an incredibly important point. Social media hygiene, I think, is a really important part of this. And the people who I think are best at social media, I am not one of them, believe me, but the people who I find are really adept at using social media effectively have a very well cultivated set of things they use it to talk about, and they don't stray out of their lane. So they talk about their sector, or they talk about the thing that they're interested in, and they really stay focused on that. And they're not all over the place with their interest in this thing. And oh, look what happened in the news yesterday. And there was that other thing. And I find that people who have well formed identities on social media, whether they're in business or not, are the ones who have a sense that they know how to stay in their lane. And I think that that's a valuable thing for you if you're a young entrepreneur and you're looking at what's my social media profile and how do I align it with my business goals. That doesn't mean you can't be political. It means you better be really clear about
mhm.
how you're political and what the audience is that you're trying to reach, attract, and know who you might potentially repel by being so.
You know, even as we're talking, I'm thinking of sometimes even internal communications. Um, I Years ago, it's got to be 20 some years ago, I did a study of written performance evaluations. Now, performance evaluations are not communication in public communication,
Yeah.
obviously, but they are communications, and we had to find how find out what guidelines, what rules, new rules would really help managers convey what they needed to convey without without destroying the person, because you
Mm-hmm.
don't want to destroy your employees just to give them feedback, uh, nor reflective of your biases. And that's a real tricky thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And and there was a case where it's internal, and yet it was a really important communication. So and I think this last piece, have a process.
Mm.
That was what we did. We basically said to people who were being evaluated, you write something that conveys well to your manager what you've been doing, and
Mm-hmm.
specifically, because it was specifics that was the important thing. So that was a process that we introduced there.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I think you're right about that. You need process for evaluating employees, you need process for hiring people, and you're trying to be as unbiased in these things as you can. And similarly, when you're thinking about communicating internally or communicating externally, process is your friend. Yes, it can slow things down, but part of that slowing things down is making sure you do the outreach so that you're not ambushing people and committing unforced errors.
Yeah. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground. Well, I want to make sure that people know how to get in touch with you. And then I'm going to introduce a rather exciting final step. But let me give you the mic so that you can tell people how to get in touch with you.
Well, the easiest way to find me is either at my website, MatthewKohut.com, or at KNPCommunications.com. And I am on LinkedIn and Blue Sky these days. So you're welcome to find me there too.
Great, great. Well, I'm excited because we're going to do grounds for thought now, but we're going to do it differently because Matt has agreed to join me in this. So without further ado, every now and then, there is something that changes how I think about the world. Grounds for Thought is a place where I talk about these moments so that you can explore the meaning for yourself. About 10 years ago, I decided to pivot my business. I had been doing management consulting around the world, running retreats, speaking to large audiences, writing books, coaching some amazing clients. But this pivot was to let me focus myself on just writing, speaking, and coaching. That was it. It would reduce the amount of travel that I would have to do, and it would give me more time to share what I know about management with others, like everybody in this audience. I kind of got excited about the change, and I believe in preparing myself. And even though I had done all of what I wanted to do before, I wanted to hone my skills even more. And I spent 5 years studying how to create good speeches and how to give them. I loved all of my preparations. I mean, I worked with several stellar coaches from California to London, each specializing in certain aspects. I never, ever regretted the investment of time or resources to make that happen. So when the opportunity came to do a show on radio, I was excited. I mean, it wasn't the same as speaking to a live audience, because I love doing that, by the way. But radio gave me the opportunity to talk about management issues, whether about a business or a career or even family. And it gave me the opportunity to meet people from all over the world. I mean, I'd call them up and say, would you please join me on Unlocked? It was called Unlocked then, there too. And, and join me on my radio show. Because the virtual world of the internet made it all possible. Well, it turned out that I loved doing the show. I was able to do it in a way that allowed listeners to call in questions that I would answer. It was my favorite part of the show because it was like a puzzle that I had to solve, and I love to do puzzles. And I was told that my audience was about 600,000 strong. I mean, it was really terrific. But then I had the opportunity to bring my show onto TV. This very station, E360 TV. And I figured out, hey, this is going to be a slam dunk. I had been doing the show on radio, and all I had to do was get a good camera, right? Not exactly. There's a bit more about setting up a studio when video is done. There are lights, and there's backdrops, and there's quality of cameras, and there's opening videos to create. I was really surprised. But in my usual manner, I just studied up and put it all in place and brought Unlocked to TV. 3 years ago, in March of 2022, I invited Matt Kohut to come and talk about Beyond Your Authentic Self. I love that topic, by the way. Now, I knew I wanted to have him on because I knew he had a strong reputation for helping others with their speaking. So I took the opportunity and I asked him if he would please give me some feedback after the show. Tell me something I can do to improve the show. Fortunately, he agreed. Now, Matt always is prepared and has good information to share, as you have already seen. And the show went very well. When I had ended and closed the show, I turned to Matt and asked for his feedback. It was then that I learned something. He told me about my professionalism, which I very much appreciated. And then he said, but I suggest that you watch one of your shows again and watch how you open the show, how you look at that time, and how you look at the end of the show. He said I opened the show very professionally, but I warmed up as I talked with my guest. And by the end, my closing was very warm as a result. Okay. Now, Matt, you agreed to be a part of this conversation.
That's right.
I assume you remember that.
I do.
So, did I improve?
I would say yes. And I'm not saying this just to fluff you, but I've been really struck by how consistent you've been through the broadcast. So to my mind, absolutely, I felt the improvement. So go Madeline.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that because everybody tells me I'm a warm person when they meet me. So did I, I just couldn't believe that I wasn't conveying my warmth right from the very beginning. So anyway, my intention was obviously to bring more of myself into the opening, which apparently I do now. So that really makes me really very happy. By the way, this is totally extemporaneous on Matt's part.
Job well done.
What?
Job well done. Really.
Okay. All right. Now I'm going to challenge you.
Okay.
What more could I have done?
Where that was concerned, I don't really think there is anything. You've been doing this a long time, and I guess if I were going to give you some piece of advice here, which I'm really grasping a little bit, but the only thing I would say is just trust your instincts. You have so much muscle memory to draw on that when you have that spidey sense that you can go in a certain direction with somebody, or that you can be a little more vulnerable, let your guard down a little bit, trust your instincts at this point, because you know what you're doing and you're not going to step into a major problem area because you know what, you've got so much experience that that's never going to happen. I would say just really trust your gut.
Thank you. I'm learning to do that, and it takes time to feel that way. It does.
It's
Yeah.
expert judgment. You have expert judgment as a communicator at this point, and I think that relying on that now will actually free you in lots of ways as you continue to do this.
That's exciting, Matt. Thank you for this, and I apologize for putting you on the spot.
I enjoy it.
Good. Well, I'm almost out of what I wanted to say today, but let me just toss the ball back to you in case there's anything further that you want to share with the audience before we close.
No, I just am really grateful for the opportunity to talk about these subjects with you. And I think that this challenge around communicating around political and social issues is one that a lot of people resist. They think it's something maybe businesses shouldn't deal with, and they try to avoid it at all costs. And I would just encourage people to be open-minded about it and really enhance their awareness of where this is going on at all times, and think about whether there are opportunities that they should be taking advantage of that they've let slide in the past or not. And just really, my call here is for awareness more than anything.
Matt Kohut, thank you so much for today.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Madeline. Thank you so much for having me.
Having feedback from a good coach or manager or colleague is pure gold. but so too is feedback from a listening audience. Now, I know there's a big audience out there. I watch my numbers and they just keep growing every month. So I know I must be talking to somebody out there. What I'd really like to do is hear from you, because you are why I do this. So in any event, I no longer think that I've mastered the topic. I don't care what Matt says. I want to hear from you. Send me an email. What is it that you would like me to do more of, less of? Is there a topic that just is, really piqued your curiosity? I can find amazing people to come in and talk on just about any topic. So please send me an email, Madeline@MadelineBlair.com. Well, thank you for joining me today. And I hope you've enjoyed the conversation and learned something new. I think you can tell I enjoyed the conversation. And again, if you have a question that you'd like me to explore on Unlocked, send me an email. And I really do want to hear that feedback from you. And if you're on YouTube, now this is a great way for you to give me some feedback. Click the like button and subscribe, because it helps me and it helps others who are trying to find information like this. So thanks for doing so. I'm Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock the resilient leader in you.